eddy currents, toroids, and fundamental patterns of energy flow in nature. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. So throughout our Qigong practice, and of course all of the principles and philosophy behind Qigong, we look to nature to understand the patterns of energy flow within nature, and then we find those same patterns of energy flow within ourselves, and we work to activate those, balance them, and so on to create harmony, health, vitality, and well-being. Now, the patterns that we find of energy flow in nature, they vary from the very large out to the size of galaxies and solar systems, down to the more, you could say, human scale that we see all around us all the time. Things like rivers. So I'm beside a river today, and the way that that flows, the patterns of flow in oceans and their ocean currents, their waves, and so on. And even down smaller, down to the molecular or even atomic scale, we see these patterns of energy flow, and we learn from them, and we recognize how they flow within us. Now, a lot of those patterns that we focus on in our Qigong practices are at this more human scale, for lack of a better term. So the scale of oceans, waves, rivers, and so on. But there are fundamental patterns that go down at a smaller scale behind that. And these are really useful to understand as well. And we do work with these within a variety of Qigong practices. And in fact, it's these smaller scale patterns that actually join together to make these larger scale patterns of things like rivers. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, so those patterns of rivers, that's very much like our organ meridians. The patterns of ocean currents, that's like the extraordinary meridians, and so on. So I'm going to talk about a very specific example of one of the deeper, more fundamental patterns of energy flow that make up these larger flows. But I guess first, just, what are some of these fundamental patterns of energy flow? It's things like expansion and contraction. Super simple, but that's one of the most fundamental patterns. And then we get into things like circular movement. We see circular movement throughout nature, and that's, again, one of the fundamental patterns of energy flow. From this comes things like wave motion, spirals, vortices, and the specific one that I want to talk about is toroids. So we see toroidal patterns throughout nature as well. And just the other day, I came across this really cool one, and I was actually talking about it with some of the people in one of the courses that's running at the moment, and how I'd come across this cool example, because I find it fascinating. Some of the patterns are really obvious, we see them regularly. Others are like, oh wow, that's a different example of that. And whenever we see these patterns in nature, I think it helps us to understand a little better how they function in ourselves as well. So I'm going to try to show you this here. Some of it may not show up too well on the camera, but we'll see. I'll give it a go. All right, so here we have a river flowing, and I think you can probably see on the camera, we have this strong flow of water out in the middle of the river, moving from right to left across the screen. Yeah, you can probably see those ripples moving across. But the flow is not uniform. Here, on this side here, you might see, ooh, okay, the pattern of movement on the water is not as clear as we see this really directional flow out in the center of the river. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what's going on here. So there's a few different movements here. Effectively, we'd call these different movements on the side of the river eddy currents of different sorts. But there's this really cool one that's actually functioning quite smoothly through here, but it's not so easy to see unless I'm going to try showing you by throwing a leaf out onto it. There we go. Can you see that leaf? And that is actually hitting very clearly in the opposite direction. Look, it just keeps on going in the opposite direction from this main flow of the river, which is heading from right to left. So I'm going to show you that one more time. I'm going to throw another leaf out. There's a bit of wind, so it's a bit hard for me to throw it. So here we go. Oh, that blew away in the wind. Let's try another one. And there you go. You can see this one. And then the eddy current takes it. It's a weaker current, but still it is clearly moving from left to right, back in the opposite direction up the river. All right, so pretty cool, or at least I think it's pretty cool. I think I'm fascinated by things that maybe not everyone else is fascinated by, and that's okay. So I'll explain maybe a little bit more of the significance of this, and why toroids are so cool, so interesting. This is effectively, an example of a toroidal flow, where wherever we get a strong linear flow of energy, it tends to set up a counterflow that comes around off the side and then back the other way, and then it goes through. And for a full toroid, we're going to see this on both sides. So we'd have a linear flow through the middle, and then we'd have a counterflow on one side, and we'd also have a counterflow on the other side. Now, in a river that's going to be somewhat two-dimensional, it is three-dimensional still, but somewhat two-dimensional, we see this in three-dimensional patterns often as well. So again, a strong flow through the middle, and then it will be all around in three dimensions, all around that strong linear flow. We have this reverse flow, and probably one of the easiest recognized examples of this is in a magnet or an electromagnet, where we have a strong flow through the center of the magnet, and then we see the magnetic field coming back around, and it's actually that toroidal pattern of counterflow that creates the magnetic field. We also see it in nature. A good visual one of this is if you cut an apple in half and you see the core goes through the middle, and then the shape branches out to each side, forming that toroidal shape. The whole structure of the apple forms around a toroid, and we see it many other places as well. We see it within our own bodies. Some of them much more clear than others. Again, it's specifically when we have very strong linear flows that it forms a very clear toroid, or this pattern of toroidal flow is making up some of the larger flows anyway. We have different patterns all connected together, so several toroids all in a line can start to make a flow like a river moving through it, and so on as well. And again, often within different Qigong practices, we focus on some of those somewhat bigger flows, like the flow of a river, and that's really useful, working with our organ meridians and so on. Sometimes it's really helpful to dig down to that smaller level, and it allows to work with our energy in some quite powerful ways when there's something that's blocked or stuck or needs to be rebalanced or reset in some way. So a whole range of different Qigong practices work with these more fundamental, small scale. It's interesting actually, the same things we see at a really small scale, we also see at a really big scale. So we see these same patterns out, at that massive scale of planets, solar systems, galaxies and so on as well. But so sometimes coming out to these more fundamental patterns of energy flow, it helps us to reset things and so on. And we see this, sorry, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we do find these patterns used in many different Qigong practices, where we use circular motion, where we use wave type motion, where we use expansion and contraction and so on. Within the long white cloud Qigong practices, somewhere we see these really clearly, maybe more clearly than in some of the other practices. In the Wuji Qigong practices that we do as part of the Elemental Alchemy program, we are working with some of those very, very fundamental patterns of energy flow to reset the energy at a deep level. Also within some of the Taiji practices as part of the Elemental Alchemy program, which again, we're working with the fundamental principles of polarity, yin and yang, and getting those functioning smoothly. So it's natural that we would see these fundamental patterns come out clearly and strongly within them. The other place where we really use these fundamental patterns a lot is in some of the Qigong healing applications, whether that's Qigong self-healing or when we're applying Qigong healing working on other people as well. These fundamental patterns are really effective for correcting issues that might be occurring within the energy flow. And it's actually within a Qigong self-healing course that I was mentioning this to some of the participants recently, that I saw this really cool example of one of these patterns in this flow of a river. Now, there are some specific features of what's going on in this river as to why this pattern has set up so clearly here. You won't always see it clearly like it is here in all rivers. It's to do with the way the river is bending and the way it's narrowing and varying in depth and so on. I won't get into all the details of that, but still, I just find it really fascinating to see these cool examples of energy in nature. Anyway, hopefully that's been at least a little bit interesting. I guess if you made it this far, it was at least a little bit interesting. Sorry if I repeated myself a little bit as I went through this. If you've enjoyed the vlog, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all those good things. And I look forward to seeing you on another one soon.